I just want to say how proud I am to be a member of our community today, our community of early childhood professionals and families, our community of learners, and thank you for your dedication in wanting to learn more to help our children and our families. And I hope you get some information today that you can go back and use right away. If you ever have any questions or need anything throughout the day, please feel free to find me and I will do my best to make sure your needs are met. So I'm going to open it up with an introduction of our first speaker. Jessica Beer is a developmental psychologist in Carmel, Indiana. After spending several years as a research scientist studying language and neurocognitive outcomes in children with deafness and hearing loss, she co-founded the Urban Chalkboard Play Cafe and Learning Studio. The storefront concept serves as a platform to bring play-based learning opportunities to children from birth to 6 years old, and to provide a professional and social network to women and men raising young children. Jessica's vision is to continue to partner with diverse industries like tech, childcare, education, cities, and public spaces to create ventures that promote innovation and collaboration among key stakeholders regarding early learning practices and environments. Please welcome Dr. Jessica Beer.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the great introduction, Dr. Cervisi, and thank you to Hamilton Southeastern Preschools for inviting me to talk about how we can support mental health very early. As Kelly said, I am a developmental psychologist. I spent most of my training in the lab at IU School of Medicine at Riley, working on a very narrowly defined population of children with deafness. And so all the children from the region who come to Riley Hospital for cochlear implantation, they would participate in our research, and we would look at language and cognitive development and brain development over time. And the kids have a sensory deprivation, and we want to know what is the impact of that on learning and on social development, emotional development, and those are the kinds of things that I studied. And then after about 10 years, I thought I wanted to do something a little bit different and bring some developmental science into the everyday lives of parents. And so I co-founded the Urban Chalkboard Play Cafe, which is a space where parents with young kids come. It kind of feels like a coffee shop and your living room, and the kids play in there. It's all child-directed, appropriate play, and the parents hang out and work. They use us like a coffee shop. So they would work, they would meet their friends, just have a minute to themselves where they don't have to look good or anything while their kids are playing. So, you know, when you have one of those days with little kids, when you're raising little kids. As far as pediatric mental health disorders go, we're definitely seeing an increase in issues, especially we're seeing them play out in the older kids. And I'm sure you guys see the beginnings of it because it starts very early. Just some stats for you. Nearly a third of 13 to 18-year-olds will experience an anxiety disorder sometime in their lifetime. 20% increase in the diagnosis of anxiety between 2007 and 2012 in our teenagers. Visits to the hospital for suicide attempt, suicide ideation are increased. They've doubled between 2008 and 2015 in our 12 to 17-year-olds. So we've got a real problem playing out in the older ages, which we all know it starts early. So I really am grateful for the privilege to talk about development and what we can do early, what you're seeing in the classroom as education professionals. And I'm hoping my goal is to provide you through this talk with kind of a developmental lens through which to approach the breakout sessions. So we'll talk a lot about development, brain development, that kind of thing, so that you can think about your classroom or what you're doing with children with kind of this developmental lens. So the way the talk will go, and I would love questions at any time. Just raise your hand or shout out that you have a question, no problem. But we'll first talk about how experience shapes the brain. There's been such advances in developmental science and brain science that we can now see things that we never used to be able to see with technology, with babies and learning. So kind of using that to inform our view of learning and development. I'm going to talk about play as a very powerful learning context, and then how play is essential for the development of very early learning skills that are important, specifically executive function development and social emotional development. So right now I'd like you guys all have some paper and pens on your table. If you would just we'll take 1 minute, and if you could write down one of your favorite play memories from when you were young, and think about the people who were involved, the materials, where you were, some emotions you might have been feeling, your age, that kind of thing. But just kind of reflect back to something that was one of your kind of favorite play memories, and just take a moment to write that down. Okay, just a couple more seconds. So when you think about what you wrote down, how many of you, just by show of hands, had some very strong emotion at the time of the play experience? It was an emotionally powerful play memory for yourself. Anybody? Yeah. Emotion's a big part of what makes play a great play context. And what about how many people their play was unstructured or maybe unsupervised? Yeah. I think like my generation, I was allowed to kind of go out and do what I wanted, and it's harder now to do that. But I think that unstructured, unsupervised child agency part of play is so important. And then how many of you, during your play memory, you were creating something new, or maybe using novel materials that you hadn't used before? Okay, yep. And then how many of you were playing with someone else or collaborating on something or working together towards a goal? Yeah. And then looking back and as an adult, do you feel, how many of you feel like you were at the time learning something valuable, like the kinds of things you want the kids in your classroom or the kids who you serve to learn? I mean, it could be social engagement, it could be confidence. You were learning something at the time. At the time you didn't know it, but now looking back you kind of do. So, I mean, I think that the most raised hands were in the unstructured, unsupervised play, and I think we're really, as a community and culture, trying to get back to that a little bit in the best way that we can. And it's very powerful, I think, when you think about the emotions and the collaborations that happen in play. It's a very powerful context for learning. And we have that opportunity to bring this to our children, you know, every day as parents, as professionals. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about is what that looks like and why play is such an important learning context. But we kind of touched on that kind of here. Any questions, or anybody want to comment on play or something that was missing from the definition that you felt like you learned? Have you guys followed or heard anything about Anji play, A-N-J-I play? It's a movement in China that's been going on for about 10 years, but the kids, it's probably if you saw some of their videos, you can just follow them on Instagram. I think that's the most powerful way to follow them, but it's a whole movement of allowing children to be, you know, it's all child-directed play in outdoors, using wood, using nails, setting up an environment where kids, you know, it's probably, we wouldn't do it here, or it's difficult because of the safety thing, and it's such a litigious space that we live in. But if you watch the videos, you just get so inspired by some of the things that the kids are able to do together when they're given this play environment. So it's really, and they're also doing trainings and things like that. So I think they're trying to spread it to different places in China. But it's a really great. It's some inspiration that maybe we could take back with us. But okay. So when we talk about, the first part that I was going to talk about is brain development and how experience impacts brain development. And developmental neuroscience shows us that the brain is like a muscle. Whatever gets done over and over, it gets strengthened in your neural network. And relationships and experiences are really the foundation of creating your neural architecture. And those experiences we know can be safe, stable, nurturing relationships, and the American Academy of Pediatrics will call those like SSNRs. They talk about how important those things are as buffers for stress. But we know that many, many children are experiencing adverse conditions for a variety of reasons that can be chronic or can be static. And we'll talk a little bit just about this. I think Christy Goss is going to talk about ACEs, adverse child experiences, later on. But I'll just give you a tiny bit of the kinds of stressors that we kind of think about when we think about stress in kids. There's positive stress, where this is when you're learning how to walk, you run into the table because you're only 36 inches high, and it hurts and you start crying and it's stressful. But usually you have someone who comes and comforts you and you feel better soon. So it's actually, it increases the body's stress response, but it decreases it right away. And it actually has a positive tilt to it because it creates some confidence and security and some agency to know that, oh, it's all going to be okay and I'm in charge. So it creates kind of a learning experience for the child. And then we have something called tolerable stress. And this is a little bit more chronic, but something like a divorce going on in your home. And so you're probably dealing with a little bit more stress on a day-to-day basis, a lot of change maybe in the home environment, that kind of thing. But these things also can be buffered by the SSNRs, the safe, stable, nurturing relationships, through mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whomever it is, can provide like a buffer for those kinds of things. And then we have toxic stress. And in toxic stress, it's really like the body's stress response turns on and it just can't turn off. And it has a huge impact on brain development and the connections that are formed early. And if you kind of, and the safe, stable, nurturing relationships, even if you have that buffer, it sometimes just isn't enough to help. So we really have to kind of think about how do we handle those situations where children are in toxic stress. And it can be likened to if you're like revving up your car engine and you've got your foot on the gas constantly and you just never take your foot off the gas. That's how the body is experiencing the world in these little kids who have toxic stress. And it can be, chronic poverty, mental health problems with a caregiver where, you've got a parent who maybe is depressed or has any other psychological diagnosis that makes it very hard for them to connect or be there for you. Abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. So we'll talk a little bit when we talk about development. I love to show a model. It just makes it a little bit easier to understand. But this is a model by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's a human health and disease model. So the green circle is our environment, and the red circle is our biology, brain architecture, brain building, and the blue circle is learning and development. And so I think the most striking thing that this graph is saying is that the ecology, which is kind of like your environment, becomes biology. So it's not saying that your environment impacts your brain development or something like that. It really is saying your experiences are becoming your biology. So it's a real shift in the lens for which we look at the environment and the importance of the environment. So we'll talk just a little bit about the green circle, ecology. Did any of you ever study Yuri Bronfenbrenner or have anything to do with Psych 101 or anything? Usually he has this ecological systems view of childhood where everything, it's not just your immediate environment that's impacting your development, but everything around it, the systems. And so if you look at, let's say we're talking about something like mental health and how it affects a child. So you will have things out here in the macro system. And the macro system are kind of our beliefs that we're around. Like, so it could be the beliefs of our community, our culture, our state, our policymakers about mental health, because that's how things get done, you know. Whatever people in power are thinking, we try to grassroots get it up, but you know that all of how we perceive the problem of mental health is much more in a systemic nature. And then we look at the exosystem. And so the exosystem are things like education and government, political systems who have the power and the money, and they make decisions about mental health and what resources are going to be given, any community education, that kind of thing. And then we have the Mezzo System. This is your immediate family, your teachers, your educators, your peers, your neighbors, what's going on in those systems about mental health and what we're talking about in the classroom. Is it social and behavioral problems, or is it more serious? And then we have the child in the middle. So ecology is really like the interaction between all of these different systems and how they trickle down to the child. But the child is actually an active co-constructor of this environment as well. So they put themselves out into the different systems that impact and go back and forth. So when you think about that big picture, you can see how experiences and early experiences are so critical for a child's development. And it's never static. There's always an interaction going on at all times because the child is a developing child. So you have a baby, and then let's say, you know, around 18 months, 2 years, no, they're not talking yet. And so you think, oh, well, what's going on? Let's go see what services are available. And then you kind of pursue that. But the child is always changing, and so their interaction with their environment is always changing, and so is yours, which impacts the child. So it's a big picture. So then we go into the biology of it all. These are actual physiological changes happening in the brain due to experience. So it's how genes are expressed, how brain architecture is formed. And we know this from some really cool research of this baby. So this is a new machine that we can that we're using for some learning and development outcomes. It's a magnetoencephalography, and it looks kind of like an MRI, but it's not. Basically, when neurons are firing, they create an electrical impulse, and this cap that the baby's wearing, and when they go in it, it can pick up on groups of neurons firing together. And so you can actually see the brain's response in real time to some sort of outside stimulus. So some of the experiments in the labs here are just, listening to different tones or voices and what parts of the brain is activated, learning new words, emotions, experiencing emotions and sounds and that kind of thing. And so they can actually see what part of the brain is lighting up and watch it over time as a child is learning a new word, for example. And so you can actually see the brain architecture being formed. And it's different than an MRI in that the children don't have to be really still. They can move around, so it gives us a little bit more ability to see children like interacting with objects and what that has to do with the brain and how the brain responds to that. And it's really quiet, so an MRI is pretty loud, and we don't really able to use it for children. And then the MRI also, it will show changes in blood volume through oxygen. So we're assuming these are the parts of the brain that are being activated when we do these things. But the MEG is actually able to detect the electrical impulses of actual neurons firing. So the potential, this particular one is created just for babies, and it's at the University of Washington. So it's really kind of cool if you want to go on their website to see the kinds of things they're looking at. Eventually, I think what they want to do is have a parent and a child in the MEG and start looking at some of those back and forth interactions that happen with parents, between parents and children, and brain response. So this is This is a picture of kind of neural development from before a baby's born up to the age of 2. And so there's just tremendous neural development going on during this time. So 1 million new neural connections every second. So it's a lot going on. So you can see at 36 weeks gestation, the really dark parts are the neurons. The little spidery spindles are the connections between the neurons. And the darker they are, the stronger the connection. So you can see even at 36 weeks gestation, we have lots of things going on. We know that babies can hear at 36 weeks. They can respond to sound. We have some cool research when I was at IU where we looked at babies to see if they could discriminate their mom's voice from a stranger's voice right after they were born. And they were able to most of the time. And they do it by like measuring how they suck on a pacifier. So we know that kids are learning things about sound and voices even when, even like at the 3rd trimester. So we see the neural connections getting stronger and more frequent. And this is all change with experience. So experience is changing the number of neurons over time, the strength of their connection, and the speed of their connection. So this is how kind of early experience gets into our biology. So when we talk about early experiences and the importance of them, I was going to just talk a little bit about a couple of ways where we can just generally kind of go-to ways to interact with kids to provide a really rich learning environment. And the first one is serve and return. Has anybody heard of serve and return before? I think it's gaining more and more popularity to kind of talk about that. Pediatricians are encouraged to talk about the importance of serve and return. And I just think for me, when I'm at the chalkboard on a day-to-day basis, if I'm trying to engage with a kid, I really sit here and think, oh, I can go to this really quickly. So here are the little pieces of it. First of all, like if you're thinking about this little girl playing cash register with her mom. So first of all, as a grown-up, you notice the serve. So this is, oh, child's behind here, they want to play cash register. I'm seeing that's what they're interested in. They're actually fingers on the buttons. So I'm going to kind of talk about fingers on the buttons. As opposed to, which I did a lot as a parent, is, hey, let's set up this play thing. Let's go play this right now. And then it's just not well received, or it doesn't last very long, or it's not very interesting to the child. So kind of meet the child where they are. So then you return the serve. So you respond to her interests positively. Oh, you're pushing the buttons. That's great. Give it a name. Label the people. Label the objects in a non-evaluative way, kind of a descriptive way. So, oh, you just touched the green one. Oh, you're touching lots of them. Oh, look, when you touch the buttons, the drawer's opening. And you're just kind of commentating, sportscastering, that kind of talk. And if there's an emotional component, it's really great. So in the other picture, we've got some joint book reading here. And books are so great for doing this serve and return, where you can see emotions in the characters and call them out. You know, oh, he's so sad. Why do you think he's sad? Let's look back in the book to see what happened. Oh, let's go forward in the book to see what happened, that kind of thing. So then you take turns back and forth, but I think the key thing is taking turns and waiting. So when you throw something out, like what happens when you push this button, and then, or how can you put, for this example, this little cash register from IKEA, the drawer doesn't want to go in very easily. So kids are always struggling with putting that drawer back in. You push the button, it pops out, and they just can't get it back in on their own. So waiting for the child to do their best to get that drawer in without waiting, you know, once they get frustrated or something like that, then we can come in and kind of scaffold that. And it might take a really long time. It might take, you know, if the child is really working hard to get that drawer in there, we just want to give them the time to be able to do that. And I think, for me as a parent, and that's really difficult to do, is to just wait and let them do it. And then the last thing about serving and returning is practicing endings and beginnings. So when you see the child, I'm kind of done here, which for kids who are 2 or 3 or this age, they won't stay on anything for very long. So you got to be willing to shift to the next thing and say, oh, I can see you're done with this. Let's go on. Or, oh, you're interested in this. Let's start this. Did you that kind of thing. So this serve and return is really great. And if you go on to the it's the Center for the Developing Child by Harvard. It's sponsored by Harvard University. You get on there, there's all sorts of incredible handouts about how to do this and what it looks like and lots of different examples. But I think it's great advice to give to the parents of the children who you work with or anybody who's kind of struggling for how do I make these great early experience and connections. So we'll talk a little bit, so that's kind of the positive, wonderful, safe, stable, nurturing relationship side of early experience, but we do know there are also adversities. So in this particular graph, this is from the Hart and Risley study. Is anyone familiar with the 30 million word gap or have heard of that? So this particular study looked at language and vocabulary development over time in 3 different environments. One in college-educated parents, working class parents, and parents who are receiving welfare. And you can start seeing the differences in vocabulary at 18 months, and then they diverge after that, so that around 36 months, children who are in the welfare homes are receiving average of 30 million words. They're hearing less than they're hearing 30 million words less than the college-educated parent's family, and that's just a matter of language going on in the home, around the home. Interactions and conversations that are happening at the dinner table that they overhear. Maybe they're playing and brother and sister are talking, that kind of thing, because we know language occurs within, language develops within interactions. And so the kids who are in families who are receiving welfare and probably don't have as many resources or don't have the conversations or the times are not hearing as many words, and their vocabulary is being impacted. And then when we look at things like toxic stress, this graph is showing a little bit about stressful experiences in children with developmental delays. So along this axis, we're looking at the number of toxic experiences. So this can be poverty, child maltreatment, a parent with depression, single parent home, low maternal or paternal education. You put 1 to 2 risk factors, 3 risk factors, 4 risk factors. Once you get up to 6 or 7 risk factors, you've got kind of a 90% chance of having some sort of developmental delay. So really the resilience and it requires relationships and safe, stable, nurturing relationships. So in this slide now I've added on the 4 to 6 year olds. So we can look to see that here you've got the foundations for early learning being laid down kind of by the age of 2 or 3, and then these higher level connections where we're starting at age 3, 4, 5, learning and reasoning skills, they're built upon these lower level, simpler connections. So the neural connections for more complex things are laid upon the more simpler ones. But this does not mean that the opportunity for brain development stops at age 3 by any means. Our brains are changeable and plastic throughout our lifetimes. The effort that it takes to change is just a little bit more as we get older. So in this graph, the blue line is showing the brain's ability to change. So when kids are really young, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's really easy for the brain neural architecture to change. But it gets tougher the older we get. And then the amount of effort that's required. So for little kids, just being in a play environment and listening and reading a book and having great conversations with parents and playing with friends is enough. Doesn't require a lot of effort, but for the grown-up, this requires a lot of effort for us. So I don't know if any of you have tried to pick up a new skill lately, like trying to learn how to play a new instrument or a new language. It's really tough, and it can be done, but usually with the older we get, the more specialized training we need. So it's harder to just pick up and learn an instrument. It's great to take a lesson and have it happen like every 2-3 days. Yes, you have a question? Yeah, the question was, does the synapse pruning happen during the, like, what was the question? Can you say one? Yeah. Okay, so when does the pruning happen? Does the pruning start happening because of adverse child experiences very early, or, but actually it's like it's a timing thing. So around 4 or 5, natural development, we start pruning our synapses. We just, your brain starts just taking out the dead connections that really aren't useful for you anymore. And so adverse child experiences, those first few slides are really making the neural connection kind of weak, and a weak foundation, that kind of thing. And then you start the natural process of pruning when you're around 4 or 5. Does that help at all? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the question is, what is the new literature saying about the 30 million word gap? And so it's kind of twofold. When they did the research on the 30 million word gap, you were going into homes and taking parent report and that kind of thing about the language environment and how many words are going on, and doing some observations. So it was all that kind of data collection over a long period of time. And not a ton of houses. So, when you make a statement, this particular 30 million word gap has gotten a lot of attention because it's kind of a sound bite for, hey, we need to focus on early environments. So the good thing is, yeah, we still do need to focus on early environments, but I think the gap is probably not 30 million words. There's some researchers who have done this kind of study to kind of replicate it, and they use a device called Lena, L-E-N-A, and it actually, the child wears it in the home, and it picks up on their language environment, every little bit of it. The words they say, when parents are talking to kids, the back and forth, conversations that are overheard, and different family environments of different income levels and socioeconomic status. They found that it's probably more like a 4 million word gap, but nevertheless, it is a gap, and the important part, I think, is that we are bringing visibility to the fact that language environments are different, and early experiences are part of that. Does that help at all, or is that what you were getting at? Or just because you see this gap at 36 months doesn't mean that is the end, and that this child is now going to have a vocabulary delay or a language delay or anything like that. They're definitely able to learn with the proper supports. I mean, I think it makes the case for providing the proper supports in the preschool and in early ed environments. But it doesn't mean that the child will be delayed forever or anything like that. And it's very much a group study too, as opposed to an individual implications for individual children. So yeah, was there another question? Yeah. Right. Yeah, she was asking that if you have a child with a language delay at home, and then there's also a second language being learned in the home, right? 2 languages in the home. So is that causing further delays in the child with a speech delay in order to, is that second language causing further delay? What the research is showing is that you should always speak the language of the heart in the home. Even with deaf children with cochlear implants, we know that we want parents to speak their spoken language because that's the language of the heart, as opposed to learning ASL or something like that, where it's going to take a big ramp-up time for adults to have, the level of grammatical and phonemic information about ASL to pass down to the kids. So yeah, I would say that pruning area kind of speaks to what you're saying. Yeah. This is kind of a visual based on what we were talking about, how kids approach learning. So if you think about the circle on the left, this is like the infant as a lantern. So the consciousness of the infant kind of very broad, picking up on lots of things, lots of different things in the environment, whereas the consciousness of the adult is kind of like a tiny little spotlight. We exploit what we know, and we try to really hard remember it and get better and better and better at very focused things. Whereas the kid is much more, hey, I'm gonna explore my environment, I'm gonna pick up on all sorts of things. So it's kind of a, how the learning environment matches what's going on in brain development. So just as kind of as a summary, this is showing how the sensory pathways are laid first, and then the language pathways, and then higher cognitive functioning like thinking, reasoning, executive functioning skills, social emotional development. So brain development's cumulative. Brains are built from the bottom up. Complex thinking needed for learning and reasoning is built on these more simple connections. If the foundation is disrupted, it does impact future neural connections, and so toxic stress and mental health is something that we need to be thinking about. So where does this lead us? So now I'll kind of switch into the next little section, which is if experiences are so important and do shape brain development, let's talk about play as a very powerful learning context for building brains. We know just some interesting, all mammals play, and there's been some really cool research that if you take play out of the mammal's life, that you can really see some differences. So it's hard to do with human babies because we can't deprive their environment, but some really interesting data on rats and mice. When you don't allow them to play like they're supposed to, you do find differences in the development of their prefrontal cortex and in their social emotional play, social play. So we do see changes in brain development. And a University of Michigan study between 1977 and 1997 was kind of looking at how play environments have changed for children. And so in that 20-year time period, they were finding that there was a 25% decrease in the time spent playing, a 55% decrease in the time spent talking to the people in your home, which is kind of interesting. An 18% increase spending time in school, and just your time in school, and 145% increase in time spent doing homework. So not at school, but you're doing it at home. And about 11 hours a week playing. So, and this study ended in 1997, so it really doesn't even capture what we're dealing with young kids now with screen time and that kind of thing. But it kind of just shows you what's happening in the lives of young children over a long period of time. So play is such an important context that the American Academy of Pediatrics actually put out a prescription for play. Has anybody seen this on their social media or anything? It's been a real push, the way the pediatrics are changing how pediatricians deal with kids and families, and how they're going to start pushing play as just as important as anything else that they push, so that the health and well-being of children are not just about their physical health, but about their mental health and social emotional development. But some of the things they are mentioning in their prescription for play is that play is the primary context for doing the serves and returns, and for providing the safe, stable, nurturing relationships that if you're playing, that's happening. And that play builds a brain that can effectively interact with each other, with others. And that children learn through observation and imitation, and active engagement with other people, which is all happening in play. Play enhances curiosity, which facilitates learning and memory. Play can decrease stress in preschoolers. There's some studies that they did with kids who are a little bit anxious about going to preschool, and so they put them into two different groups. One group could read a book with their teacher for 15 minutes, and then the other group was allowed to play with their friends for about 15 minutes and then start their day. And they found that there was a twofold decrease in anxiety in the kids who were just able to take a minute and play a little bit before entering the classroom. So we know that it does serve as kind of a buffer in stressful situations. and that play retains the child's agency. So it's the child who's kind of in charge of what they're learning and what they're interested in, and we provide scaffolding and we provide the serve in return. So you can see that what if these kinds of interactions don't happen, and if play isn't, at the center of our universe, kind of like the video said, what are the interactions that are then? So just kind of making a cognitive effort to get play back into our everyday lives. This is a nice little graphic of why play is a great learning environment. So if you think about, those little Velcro walls, and you have little tubes and things like that, and the kids can pull the tubes off and arrange them in different ways, and the balls go down and all that stuff. So we'll just use that kind of a toy as an example for how learning happens through play. So that the play, first of all, is meaningful to the child. So you're connecting novel information with existing information. So you may not realize that the tube, you can actually pull it out of the wall. You don't have to keep it there exactly where it goes. You can move it around. Help children, that it's also socially interactive. So you might have a couple of kids on the Velcro wall that may not be playing with each other, but what they're doing with the objects, one might know a little bit more than the other, and show the child how to pull really hard to get the tube off when the child didn't know that it moved. That it's joyful, and usually when it's joyful and there's heavy emotional content, we see an increase in dopamine, and the brain loves that, and we keep going, and we're really highly motivated. And it involves active, engaged, minds-on thinking. So I'm on this Velcro wall, I'm trying to get it off, I'm trying to get a ball through here. Whatever it is, there's something going on with a goal-directed behavior. And it involves iterative thinking, where you're kind of hypothesis testing. Like, kids are really great at hypothesis testing, seeing where something didn't go as they planned, and kind of switching it around and trying new things. I think if you're looking for any theory or to go back about why play is a great learning context, we can look at Lev Vygotsky. He's a Russian psychologist, and probably the leader in why play is kind of an important context for learning. But in play, a child behaves beyond his average age, beyond daily behavior. In play, it's those he was a head taller than himself. So the child is actually creating their own zone of proximal development by being in a play environment. And has everybody seen the zone of proximal development or heard about it? Where you've got, like, in the center what the child can do all by themselves. In the middle circle, they can do it, but they need a little help. And then the outer circle is kind of out of reach right now. So as teachers, educators, parents, we really try to operate within that middle circle to help them learn. And we have to say, is this task too hard? Is this task, how can we modify the task? So I'll kind of move it along to the last section, which is talking about how play is essential for learning foundational early learning skills. And I'll particularly talk about social emotional development and executive function development, because they're changing so much during the 3 to 5 year old age range, and they really those skills just shape everything else, especially at this particular age. So the prescription for play, one of the things that it said is that play is fundamental for the 21st century learning that we're expecting from our kids. So the ability to collaborate with others, the ability to reason and think outside the box, creativity, it all requires executive function, getting along with others. And these are all constructed within interactions. So for social emotional development, we're kind of talking about the process by which we encode, interpret, and process social information and interact with others. And for executive function, it's very much how do we regulate our attention? How do we regulate our behavior, our thoughts, our emotions to engage in a goal-directed behavior? So you might have heard social emotional development. You can also think of social emotional learning or theory of mind development. That kind of thing is what we're talking about. So this is all, if we talk about social emotional development and what's happening in early environments with babies, one of the things is parents who are mind-minded Have you ever heard the term mind-minded? It just means that you really look at your baby as a thinking, feeling human being beyond their capacity. So we often find parents talking to their babies like, you know, oh, I see that you want this, or you love this, or you're so smart you did this, and that kind of thing. Just kind of the baby talking about minds. And that kind of labeling and predicting their feelings that parents do is associated with kids who have some stronger social emotional skills. We look at joint attention and pointing. So pointing, a child pointing comes online at about the same time as first words and walking, which makes the sense if you think of a child in a body. They're able to stand up, they're directing your attention, and they're saying a word. It could be cat or bottle or whatever it is, but these early social emotional cues are what's going on in interactions with young children. Gaze, following, social referencing. We often see where babies will look to their parent or caregiver when something unexpected is happening. So you might be in the stroller taking a walk and a dog comes over or something like that. The baby doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to react, looks to the parent or caregiver and is like, and the parent's caregiver goes, it's okay, it's okay. And then they're like, oh, okay, it's okay. Usually, sometimes that happens. Sometimes they're still not okay if the dog's like getting in the stroller. But they really do look to others. They're just such social, imitative human beings that are learning all these social emotional skills. And so as parents and educators, just to label that, oh, that was a dog, it was scary, or he got right up on you. Remember last time he did that and it wasn't bad and he licked your face and it was okay. You know, those kinds of conversations are where social emotional development is happening. Book reading, they're great, is a great resource for that for all ages. So that's kind of like the infant timeline. And then for preschoolers, we just take it to a whole other level, because at this time they're able to not only identify emotions, recognize emotions, they can manipulate emotions, they can do all sorts of things. They understand social meaning, they know how to interpret other people's thoughts, and they can express their own feelings and identify and solve complex social problems. And it's really great as a teacher or as a parent to kind of talk about your own feelings to your child, to kind of explain what it's like. So when you're having a bad day, you know, like, I woke up late, I'm a little stressed out, I know that I'm not interacting like I usually do, you know, just kind of talking about that kind of stuff really, really helps contextualize emotions. And then some of the research that we're finding is that there's more mental state words in play than in non-play, so we use those great words like think, believe, know, remember, love, hate, you know, all that. We use those words a lot more in a play context than a non-play context. Kids have more advanced language skills in a pretend play context. We see that their negotiations with a friend are, they can work out disagreements. They might expand on what the child said, and those things happen a lot more within a pretend play context than in a non-pretend play context. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to switch here to executive function. And this is such a big topic, and it's really how children learn rather than the content of what they're learning. And right now, where the research is, it's these three particular skills. So we're looking at working memory. So if you're looking at these kids building this block, working memory is the ability to hold information in our head over a short period of time in order to meet a goal. And so they might have, down here when they were building this section, know that there's a weak link right here. They got to remember when they put something heavy on that left side, it might tip this over. That kind of working memory within a goal. And we see it every day. We do it every day. Inhibitory control, so to be able to filter your emotions and your thoughts out to build this tower. So decreasing frustration, taking your time putting the block on instead of just putting it on, that kind of thing. And then flexibility, cognitive flexibility to switch gears when something goes wrong. So when a piece of this falls down, or when the friend actually made the piece fall down that you just spent 5 minutes building, to shift between the different emotions that you feel and what you're going to do next. These things are really all part of getting kids ready for the classroom if we can build these executive function skills early. This is a little bit about pretend play and how you can build executive function skills during pretend play. It's really different because the kids kind of have to stay in their role. So sticking to your role requires a lot of inhibitory control. You know, if you're the fireman rescuing people, you know, you stay in that role. And you can flex in and out of pretend also. And a lot of times when kids are playing pretend, they spend a great deal, probably 70% of their time just planning the play rather than actually enacting the play. So the planning of the play is so important for executive skills because you're planning and organizing your thoughts, usually with another person. So you have to think about their mental state and their feelings and what they want to do. It's just a very rich environment for working on executive functioning skills. And here's just some basic research findings that I'm sure you guys have heard about, but executive functioning being a better, a good, if not better, predictor of academic performance than IQ, and that it does predict math and reading, overall school achievement. It's critical for creativity and collaboration. And there's a, has anyone heard of the Tools of the Mind curriculum? It's a preschool curriculum. I have the book at my table in the back, but it's really a preschool program that's built all around developing executive functioning skills. And it's really got some great tips on there about things that you can do at the classroom and with kids with different ages. So that is kind of it. Supporting mental health starts early in interactions. And we can support and advocate for children in the classroom and in our communities. But we also need support as educators. So I think going to conferences like this and learning from others and reaching out in your network to get the support that you need and advocating for it is really important as well. And I'll just leave you with a tiny little snippet of the Urban Chalkboard and the way we bring play experiences to families. The mission of the Chalkboard is to bring play-based experiences to kids in a really fun way, but also to support parents raising young kids. And we want to take developmental science out of these labs and just bring them to the real world environments. And those are the kinds of things I enjoy doing, how we put the important parts of play into their environment. So I think that wraps it up for me now. Oh yes, please ask a question. Yeah, that's a great point and question is when we talk about environmental stressors and risk factors, what about actual like environmental stressors like poor water and different chemicals that get into children's environments? And I think that there's a lot of ways that impacts the ecology that the child is living in long term. So the one circle we didn't talk about on the outside of Bronfenbrenner's is the Chrono System. So over time, you see impacts, that can be mediated by, help and support, and some that get worse. And I feel like, that if you talk about something like Flint, where you have families who, they've got a serious immediate problem, but then they also have a problem in other parts of their system where they feel like no one's listening to them, no one's taking them seriously, no one is really doing anything about it. How does that make you feel as a parent in your own home, feeling that you have any control over what's happening? So that part of the stressor to me is also a parent stressor. I don't know where it fits in, if it, on the 1 through 8 toxic stressors, but I can imagine that for particular families, it's absolutely one of the risk factors, and especially over time. Does that help? But it's something we're not talking about. And even when I was researching, when I was doing the research for this study and even looking through I wanted to show you the resources page. Even looking in all of these, I never did see anything about actual like an actual environmental impact or a stressor. But I know there's got to be studies out there about it, but it wasn't called out. So thank you for bringing it up. Yeah, and thank you for your time. And I do have a booth over here and we can talk. I brought all these books with me, most of them over there, if you'd like to thumb through them or if you'd like to talk in a little more detail about anything. These are incredible places to follow on Twitter and Instagram. And there's all sorts of great resources for you, maybe for the parents and families, and just ways to get involved, cool trainings. But I thank you very much for your time.